So I'll go ahead and get started, and we'll just welcome people in as they join. Welcome from everywhere you're coming in from. My name is Andy McNeil, and I am the CEO of the Compassionate Friends. I This topic today is one that I have presented numerous times, and actually on different components of the topic. So certainly looking forward to our conversation today and what we're going to present. This webinar series that we've put together starting really back in December. Our goal is to continue this and keep it going. If you have ideas or topics that you would like to hear us discuss or research and present, please feel free to drop those topic ideas into the chat. We are able to pull the chat feed, and we'll go back and look and see what you might have suggested. Also, if you have presenters or people who you've heard speak that were effective or you felt like was helpful information, please drop those names and information and make that suggestion. We are looking for folks to be able to provide these webinars on a regular basis for the Compassionate Friends. I also just want to give a reminder that in really just a few weeks now, we have the 49th annual TCF conference happening in Baltimore, Maryland. I encourage you to take a look at that. If you're going to be there, I'll look forward to seeing you and being able to meet you in person. If you're not able to be there, we understand. We actually have some plans for a fall virtual retreat, and there'll be more information coming out on that very soon, and we hope you can participate in that. If you're still on the fence on whether you're going to be with us in Boston, encourage you to consider being there. We're going to have a great time together of support and validation and uh, seeing folks we haven't seen in a long time. That the conference is so many things to so many different people. If it's your first time at the conference, look for us. We will greet you, and we want to welcome you in, and just know that you're not alone. That there's plenty of people there who care and will receive you with care. So look for us when you get there, and we'll be there to greet you. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and kick off our topic for today. We're going to be talking about intentional living. Just like many topics we might discuss around grief or living with grief or really profound loss, grief as a result of profound loss in our lives, these topics can be difficult, uh, for lack of a better word, and really difficult doesn't quite get it. It's challenging to have these conversations because we don't ever want to come across as if we are giving easy answers or that we are assuming that grief is not difficult and challenging, or that we're making assumptions that grief is a choice that we make. Grief happens to us. And so when we have top conversations like this, I want to put out the right intention. And the intention is to simply put forward ideas, perspective, thoughts around what it means to live with profound loss and how we lean into our personal agency in the midst of that. And that might look very different at different times in our grief. So some of the things I say today, you might receive well. Some things they may not apply, and that's okay. I put together my presentations based on certainly my personal experience, but also things that I have gleaned along the way from the thousands of people who I've been able to sit with, whether in a support group or in one-on-one counseling, whatever that might look like, ideas that people have shared with me as well. I'm just passing those along the way. There is no right or wrong way to grieve. Grief is an experience that we live. And so I just wanted to put that out there up front. And I'm going to share my screen and we'll go ahead and get into the topic today. Components of living intentionally after profound loss. And as I was saying, just a few things before we start. I'd like to just validate that there are certain societal constructs of grief that are misleading. uh, Constructs around predictable stages or set timelines or normative intensity, that this is how grief should be, and if it's more intense than that, then somehow uh, you're not doing that right or something's wrong. The idea of moving on or getting over or restoring back to something, going back to life the way it was. Those are all misleading constructs that are often touted in our society. And in some ways, they perpetuate the stigma that is attached to grief. It's this idea that grief should be this certain thing, and it perpetuates misinformation, uh, in some ways, unaddressed grief, because we hear this description and we think, oh goodness, if that's how what I'm experiencing, I should try to avoid that. And instead of leaning into our grief and experiencing grief, which we know, as painful as it is part of living with profound loss, is experiencing our grief. Instead of doing that, we often will hide our pain from others, or maybe just push our pain down inside because we believe that we're not doing it right. The reality is that, though, that grief is an experience that we live. It's not a problem that we're solving. It's not something to get rid of or to get over. Grief is enduring, and it's messy, and it's extremely disruptive, beyond painful. It's unbearable at times, or it's life altering, and it's personal. Belongs to My grief belongs to me, and your grief belongs to you, and my experience isn't necessarily the same as yours, and yours the same as mine, even if we've had the same loss. Though there's a comfort in knowing that others are walking with you as well. And then the other thing I just wanted to make note is that coping with grief is also hard. So, again, the things I'm going to say during this presentation are simply ideas. They're things to consider. And if they are not things that you can apply at this moment in your life, it's okay. This is not a judgment. No one's pointing fingers. Grief is hard work. And it sometimes feels like the coping piece is unattainable or impossible. And I just wanted to verify, just to say that before we got started, so nothing I say during this time would be misconstrued or misinterpreted as saying that you have to experience things in this way, or that if you don't cope in this way, then something's wrong with the way you're coping. These are, again, just simply ideas about grief and how we cope. The other thing, I'll just say a few more things about the presentation. The presentation offers ideas and perspectives to lean into our personal agency and to lean into our grief. So I'm not saying that we only focus on coping and living and we never into our grief, because that actually is not um, optimal. What is optimal is that we lean into our grief and we lean into life orientation. We do both, and we'll talk about that more later as we move through this. And then the other thing is that not all ideas in this presentation will apply to you. Embrace the insights that apply to where you are right now in your grief, and also leave behind those things that don't apply at this moment. Intentional living, which is what we're going to talk about today. Intentional living, the concept of intentional living, does not take grief away. I want to be very clear about that. It can be a tool for learning how to carry grief. It can be a tool for experiencing the painfulness of our loss and how we can do that. It can be a tool for incorporating our loss into our new normal. But it does not take grief away, and that's not the purpose of it. The purpose is to, again, to generate some ideas around what it might look like, to be very intentional about the way that we live our lives, even in the midst of our grief. So, with those things, let's just dive right in, and let's start with looking at the definition of intention. When we say intentional living, there's that word intention in there. This I got these just from Webster's dictionary. Um, just going to look to see how Webster defined it. Uh, there were two definitions that I think apply to what we're talking about. One definition is what one intends to do or bring about. Intention, what one intends to do or bring about. And I thought of the word mindfulness when I read that definition. The idea that what am I intending to do in this moment? I might add to it. Or what do I want to bring about in this moment? And we all know that there are things, plenty of things in our lives that we don't have control of. So often, sometimes it feels like the things we don't have control of have the most, get the most attention from us in our lives because they causes the pain and the frustration. And certainly our losses are things that we could not control. The death of someone in our life, um, or or that last time we saw them, we can't control that. We can't go back and do that differently. I've had people who have said to me, if I could, I would I would have said or done something differently if I would have thought this was the last time I was going to see my person, or we even go back and say, in that moment I thought about it and I knew that they were dying, but I didn't say the things I wanted to say. And we kind of judge ourselves based on today, and that becomes hard because those aren't things we can't bring those things about. We can't do anything about those things. Um, So intention defined is really about what we intend to do right now and moving forward, not what we intend to do in the past because we can't. We can't go back and do that, but we can set intentions right now and moving forward. Um, I've said in other presentations, one of the things that we can do with our past is we can let our past be our teacher and not our judge. And so often the past becomes our judge and not our teacher. Uh, when in intentional living, the idea is to take those things from the past, begin to think about what does that mean about now and what I intend to do moving forward. And then another definition was a determination to act in a certain way. Intention, a determination to act in a certain way. And I thought of the word resolve when I read this definition. Again, word resolve wasn't in there, but it's what came to mind for me. I'm curious what words come to mind for you, and feel free to drop them in the chat when you think about these definitions. What one intends to do or bring about, or a determination to act in a certain way. Are there words that come to mind for you? Because this is important that this topic not just be something that came from my head, but this topic is something that we all can lean into and we can give language to in our lives. And those who have seen me present before know that I believe that language is important and that we give things a language that applies to us that we can understand. I'm going to give you the language that came through for me on this topic, and again from others that I picked up, but you might be able to share in the chat some of the language that you attach to this that makes a difference. But for me, the word resolve came up. This idea, that word determination and resolve. And it made me think about the new year and how on the new year we make New Year's resolutions, right? Um, the idea of being resolute, and that there's a connection to that word of resolve or being resolute, or this is what I'm going to do. So that sense of determination. And we know that in grief can absorb so much of our time and our energy and all of those things that our just sense of determination can be challenged. But we're going to look at that idea of determination here in just a moment. Yeah, I see that Roseanne, you've said that the word purpose comes to mind for you when you think about these definitions. Please feel free to drop more words in there. If a word comes to mind, definitely I can see where purpose, right? And doesn't grief in some ways rob us of our sense of purpose sometimes, or or shifts it, or challenges it, or all of those things that are part of that. So again, feel free to share other words if they come up for you. But if we think about the definition of intention, then what? How do we define intentional living? So now let's kind of combine it all together. And I looked at Webster's for intentionality and the definitions there. I did some Googling, I checked around, I pulled some of my own words and how do those apply? And this is what I came up with. And again, you might have your own words that you'd put to it. But when I think about intentional living, I think about certain key phrases and words, and I tried to put them all into a sentence. So this might be a little bit of a run-on sentence, but it's the best that I could pull together to think about this idea of intentional living. And so here's how I would define it: being determined to make deliberate choices that are in alignment with your core values and that transcend current circumstances, societal trends, and or the opinions of others. So I'll just read that one more time. Intentional living is is being determined to make deliberate choices that are in alignment with your core values and that transcend current circumstances, societal trends, and or the opinions of others. Yeah, I see some more words here. Vision, focus. Yeah, we're going to actually talk about that, where we focus our attention. um, Vision, having some vision of what my life might look like. I know that, again, there are circumstances I can't control, but in the midst of those, what is that vision that I might have? Yeah, those are great words that we could insert here. So I would encourage you to do this. Take a picture of this screen and create your own definition of intentional living. And I hope you do. And if you do, email me, email that definition to me. I'd love to see, because this idea of intentional living really has to be purposeful. It really has to belong to me, has to belong to you. It can't just be my thoughts about it. It has to be your thoughts about it. And then collectively, we can have some thoughts around this particular thing in our lives and what that really means for us. So if that's the kind of the definition of intentional living, well, then what are the components? And you notice I did highlight certain words: determine, deliberate choices, alignment, values, and transcend. And in some ways, I think those items sort of make up components that are part of intentional living. That if we want to say, I am practicing intentional living, then somehow these components are part of that. Now, again, there may be some other things you put in here. I'd love purpose would be another great word to put in here. Vision would be another great word to put in here, right? Focus would be another great word that we could put in. So those of you who are listening, add those as components. Remember, it's not just what I'm saying, it's what we're sharing during this time together. So here are the components that I'm going to look at, though, and I'm going to share a little bit over the next 45 minutes or so. The first one is being deliberate. Then we're going to look at determination. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about alignment. And then we're going to conclude our time looking at this idea of transcendence, to transcend something, to rise above. And we'll again talk more about that in just a moment. But let's start with this first one, being deliberate. I think about an intentional living, the idea of deliberate choices. And here's this word: purpose, purposeful. in our choices, though, that we are not just victims of our circumstance, but we are making choices in the midst of that circumstance. And no matter how horrific the circumstance, we are being purposeful about the choices that we make. And at different times in our grief, we have, I think, different ability to access our personal agency. Grief, again, is so taxing, and it absorbs it affects our mind, affects us mentally and spiritually and socially and physically, right, and emotionally, and it can drain us, and it can leave us in a state where we where it becomes even more challenging and even more difficult to make the choices that we want to make in those moments. And I recognize that, and I want to make that clear. At the same time, there's this sense of being deliberate. If my energy is drained and I have little energy, little focus, all of those things, then I should really lean into being deliberate. What I really prioritize, what I'm going to direct to spend my time doing or thinking about or whatever it may be, because I have limited energy and I need to really focus on what is my next input. And it could be something as small as just getting out of bed that day. It could be just for some people may say, well, it's easy to walk out the front door, but not for everyone. That could be a huge challenge. And it's just saying, you know what? I'm going to step out the front door today. I'm going to go out into the sunlight. I'm going to, whatever it looks like, I'm going to accept coffee with a friend, accept an invitation, or I'm going to invite a friend to an invitation to have coffee together, or whatever it might look like. But it's really being purposeful about the choices that you make. It's focusing on the inputs rather than the outputs. Now, what I mean by this is we spend a lot of time in our lives setting lofty goals. I talked about New Year's resolutions before. We set these goals for ourselves. And I have a whole nother presentation on resolutions and how and what the stats are on how many of us actually follow through with our New Year's resolutions. It doesn't last very long for many people. And quite often because it's setting a goal in the future of something we want to do, as opposed to focusing on my next input. What am I going to do next rather than just weigh out what's out in the future? The other thing about focusing on inputs rather than outputs is that the output, what comes of what we put in, is not fully in our control. We only partially control that. We partially control it because there are all of these other circumstances. Some of the things that we put in may also be impacted by the decisions that other people are making around us or the circumstances of the day, whatever that might look like, weather related, um, or maybe the time that I have left in that day is not significant enough to be able to allow for that input. Whatever it might be, the point is we can't always control outcomes, but we can influence and impact outcomes by focusing on my next input. What am I bringing to this? What am I going to do with myself today? Choices, personal agency. Another way of being deliberate is to recognize that goals are only the target, they're not the destination. Goals are a target, they're not a destination. How many of you have set a goal and you started down that road, and then as you went down that road, you actually discovered things that you never thought you would discover, and the thing you thought that you wanted then becomes, well, shifted, or we shift our goal, or we shift what we actually want, because I never thought that this would be an option, but because I leaned into this, I discovered that these other things are options as well. And we can remember that when we set goals, they are just targets, and open ourselves up to receive what we receive along the way, and that it may or may not be just what we wanted, but it could be what we're getting. And we sometimes, I look at it this way, sometimes our expectation, that specific goal that we set, if we don't get that, we often can't see what we did get. Expectations can cast a shadow over what we get, receive, or what we have. And then we can't appreciate those things because we don't have this thing that we want. It's this thing I wanted. I got all this other stuff, but I wanted this and it wasn't enough. Right. And so recognize that a goal is just a target. It's not a destination. Your destination is where you end up as a result of a number of things. It could just be life circumstances, again, that you may not have full control over, or it can be things that you never thought about that happen as a result of choices that you've made in your life as well. Um, the other thing about being deliberate is being fully present in the moment. There's something about recognizing that this moment matters, what I'm doing here, because if you're going to focus on your inputs in that moment, you have to be fully present in the moment to recognize what's going on around you. The other thing about being deliberate is responding, not reacting. Reacting is something we do as a cause and effect. This happened, and so now I'm reacting in this way. And quite often reactions are we have patterns of thinking and patterns of behavior. There's an old phrase that says, when you don't know what to do, you do what you know. And so we have kind of pre-programmed reactions in our heads that this happens and then I'm going to react this way. If you'll pay attention closely with some of your relationships, you'll notice that there's a little script that you have. That if this person says this, then I say this. And then they say that, and then I tend to say this. It's the idea of tendencies, right? I tend to behave in this way in these circumstances. I tend to think this way in these circumstances. I tend to talk this way or respond this way. And so part of learning to respond and not react is recognizing what Viktor Frankl called the space that's between our a stimulus, a circumstance, and the response to that circumstance. There's this space, and he called it the freedom to choose. That we have choice in that space, and in my mind, that choice is what gives us the ability to respond. That I'm not just going to let my circumstances drive me. I'm going to choose how I respond in this moment. Now, I want to say something here. Grief is not a choice. Grief is not a choice. Grief is a normal response to loss. Grief, I'll say it this way. Some people say, well, grief is a reaction to your loss. Grief is, I think it's even bigger than that. I believe that grief is an experience. It's something that we are living. It's not just a reaction. It is something that we live because it's connected to our love and to our relationship. And those are things that we live as well. They're experiences that we have. Grief is happening to us. We are we are carrying our grief. We're not just reacting. So I just want to be clear. When I say respond, don't react, that does not mean it's not about your grief. Right? Grief feelings are normal. That's how we're made to have those feelings. What I'm talking about is how we respond in those moments of life as we are grieving. Because grief is normal, grief is natural, and grief happens, and it's the experience that we live. We have choices in the midst of that that we make throughout the day, right? Um, so I guess what I'm saying is that being deliberate isn't just making room for coping and accepting an invitation to coffee with a friend, inviting a friend to coffee, choosing to take up a new hobby of some type, going for a walk. All of those things are certainly important choices that we make in our lives. What we put into our bodies, what I choose to eat, that can have an impact. All of those things are choices, right? But I also saying that we also can make room for our grief. We're not trying to avoid grief. We're making room for grief because grief is happening to us, and we can choose to fight it or we can lean into it, and experience it in our lives as well. So making space for both grief and living, I guess, is what I'm trying to get at. And I brought this up before in other presentations. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but it's the idea of this um, dual process model of grief. Uh, Strobe and Schutt are the researchers on this, and their theory is that there is loss orientation and life orientation, and that actually it's healthier when we lean into both. We lean into loss orientation and we lean into life orientation. So we lean into experiencing our grief, missing our person, feeling the feelings, giving grief experiences a name, giving it a language, just getting out a piece of paper and writing down what are the words that connect to my grief, just like we did words earlier. What words come to mind? I know it's hard to define grief because it's an experience, but giving it words, expressing that grief, remembering um, my person, wrestling with the irreversibility of the loss. I can't go back and change it. That's what I don't want it to have exist. I rather liked my life before. I don't want to live in this. That's that wrestling with that, but also making sure that we are oscillating, that we are leaning into life orientation, even when we don't feel like it. It's meaningful life experiences. And you might say, well, I don't have any meaningful life experiences. Part of it is leaning into activities that are more likely to result in a meaningful experience. Whether it's meaningful or not, it's leaning into things that could be meaningful and continuing to do that. That's a choice. I'm choosing to do that. It doesn't feel good yet, or it doesn't feel good at the moment, but I'm going to choose to do these things. Relationships with others, new and old. What old friends am I keeping? Which ones am I letting go? Right? What new relationships will I embrace from this point forward? Coping behaviors, creativity, doing for others, everyday life experiences, routines, rituals, hobbies, etc. That's that life orientation. And so they say, there's this oscillating between the two, right? And grief again is happening. It's an experience that's happening to us. Many times it's more challenging to make the choice to lean into those life orientation things, those things that are part of that transformation of what your life is becoming, even in the midst of, and in some ways, a result of the loss that we've experienced. Um, uh, Mihai um, Csikszentmihalyi um, uh, wrote a book a number of years ago in 1990 called Flow, The Psychology of Optimal Experience. And I just wanted to let you know about this book. If you haven't read it, I'd encourage you to do so. Um, uh, Mihai surveyed thousands of individuals from across the world, came from various backgrounds, different experiences, different um, income levels, all sorts of people who lived in different cultures, because he wanted to identify what he called this state of flow, those moments when you feel most connected and present in life, and in those moments when time seems to stand still. You're not focused on the time. You're into that activity, and you're just really present and fully present. It could be a great conversation with a friend. It could be some outdoor thing that you're participating in. Any number of things that can create this state of flow. He called it It's a state of consciousness that he identified, and he wanted to know if we can manufacture those experiences of flow, or if it's just something that's circumstantial and you can't do anything about. Um, well, through his research, he did discover that we can manufacture these moments of flow in our lives. And part of it has to do with being deliberate in the moment, what we are choosing to do, how we are actually being very deliberate about where we direct our attention, that we focus on that, what's happening in that moment. A good example would be I have a push mower, and when I mow my grass, um, if I'm the whole time thinking about everything I want to do other than cut the grass, it feels like it takes 5 hours. Now, it probably takes about an hour and a half, but it feels like 5 hours if I'm thinking about everything else I want to do. What Mihai found in his research is that if we can just direct our attention to the task that is in front of us at that moment, mindfulness is really the what he was talking about, directing in that moment. So instead of thinking about everything I want to do other than cut the grass, if I focused on cutting that next row and I focused on the smell of that grass, that freshly cut grass, and I took the time to look at how nice that row that I cut looks. When we focus on what we're doing in the moment, that hour and a half feels like 30 minutes, right? It doesn't fit, the time becomes obsolete because I'm not focused on the time. I'm focused on the moment. He also found in his research, though, by default, it wasn't really what he was trying to prove out or discover. He found this pattern. I guess is the best way I can describe it. Um, that whatever it is that you give attention to is what you become. So the things you tend to focus on sort of become the things you focus on. You find yourself unable to not focus on those things, and a lot of what he discovered has been used in a lot of different types of therapy, even in recovery um, uh, therapy. The idea of where you direct your attention, what you focus on, and give attention to. And so somehow that applies to this idea of being deliberate, that I'm going to choose what I focus my attention on. Again, remember, grief is an experience, so we're experiencing it. We don't make yourself feel guilty because you're grieving. Grief is connected to a relationship and to love, and it's an experience you have. It's what else are we giving attention to in our lives? And what are we letting in? That's that deliberate nature. So intentional living is first being deliberate. Okay. The second thing with intentional living, second component is determination. Now, that's that ability to keep going, even when you don't want to, when you're ready to just give up, that you say, okay, I'm going to take one more step. Now, I don't know if we have any runners out there. I was a runner, a jogger for years, and I liked to do a little bit longer jogs. I've never done a marathon, I will say. I did a half marathon, and I've run the equivalent of a half marathon many times. Um, and I would do, a little bit longer runs. And I can remember when I first started jogging and getting my ability to go further and further, gaining that ability to go further and further. I had to lean into some determination because I remember getting at places where I'd say, okay, I don't want to run one more step. And then I would say, okay, I'm going to run one more step. And I would just do it anyway. And it's that idea of being determined. So you may have other examples of that in your life where you have applied determination, where you said, no, no, not taking no for an answer. I am determined to make this happen. I've known people over the years who got laws changed because they just had a stubborn determination. They said, I'm just going to do it. I'm going to keep doing it. And I'm not going to take no for an answer. It's that idea. There's a little bit more even behind the idea of determination. There's this idea of self-determination. So again, we're going back and we're leaning into our personal agency. We're recognizing that my circumstances don't fully determine everything about my life. There are other aspects and parts of me and parts of my life. And so, this idea of self determination, and then we go back to that freedom to choose. Remember, Frankl said between stimulus and response, there's this space, and that's our freedom to choose our response. Right. So, I'm going to choose how I'm going to respond. That should be the ability to choose. And I know it has an E on the end. The ability to choose, not just the freedom to choose, but that I have the ability to make choices. And again, there may be some choices that feel unavailable to us at times in our grief. So this is not judging anyone and where you are in your grief. There are periods of our grief that are intense, and all we can do sometimes is just breathe. Is just breathe and be there. And I get that, and if that's where you are, that's enough. That's okay for the moment. Um, but recognizing that little by little, we gain a little bit of ability to choose different things in our lives. The ability to take responsibility for our choices. So not only are we choosing, but I'm going to take responsibility for the choices that I make. And then we're back to this idea of inputs versus outputs. I can choose what I want the output to be, but I don't have full control of that output happening. I do have full control of what I'm going to choose to input into that situation. Right. And what I choose to input, again, could have a lot to do with where I am in my grief or where I am in life at that moment. Could have to do with my personal limitations. And so I recognize those. But once I decide I'm going to put this in, I can do those things. It's something that I can contribute to that moment. So maybe a way to look at it is to think about and put it in words for yourself, write sentences or words that outline what are the things that I am able to contribute. What can I contribute to my world right now, to my life, even in the midst of whatever circumstance I'm in? What is it that I can contribute? Now, Viktor Frankl, I think, talked about this the best. And I know I've talked about him in the past. If you haven't read the book Man's Search for Meaning, I would encourage you to do so. He tells his story of being in the death camps in World War II. He survived the death camps, but was the sole survivor of his family in the death camps. His entire family died. I think one sister might have survived, but the rest of his family died in those death camps. And so he is certainly acquainted with grief. And he wrote this book afterward, looking back and really looking at that idea of what was it that I could contribute when in the death camps the Nazis had taken everything from us. I had no freedoms. The circumstances decided everything: when I woke up, when I went to bed, when I ate, if I did eat, what kind of work I did when I was in those camps. All of those things were determined by someone else. There wasn't self-determination there. But where could I lean into that self-determination? When could I do that? How could I do that? He asked that question. Frankl leaned into determination as a state of mind. What he found is that when my circumstances, when I could not change my circumstances, my determination had to do with my state of mind, not just behaviors at the expense of others, right? Or just my circumstances. So he leaned into three things. He leaned into creativity. So when he was given a task, he decided that he had a little freedom in the doing of that task. He could decide to do it to the best of his abilities. I mean, he could have done it, halfway or anything like that, but he determined self-determination. He determined that he was going to do a work or do a deed. He was going to do it, and he was going to take stock in it. So he said he would clean a kitchen and then he would step out and look at that kitchen and how clean it was. And he would take some amount of personal pride in that, that he chose to lean into it fully. The other thing he found is that experiencing something or encountering someone, he met people along the way who were determined to just survive, and they didn't care at what cost. And so it could be even the cost of others and relationships. He decided that he was going to not do that. He was going to lean into his relationships, though he couldn't fully control who he was in relationship to because the Nazis separated people out, they separated families, all of those things. He still leaned into and encountered the people around him and considered them and didn't just think about his own well being and his own survival, but he focused on those relationships. And that was a choice he was making in the midst of that circumstance. And then the third thing that he leaned into was the control of his attitude. By the attitude we take towards unavoidable suffering, he called it the last of human freedoms. The attitude we choose, even in the midst of of unavoidable suffering in our lives. Now, I think it applies certainly to a situation where we're experiencing profound loss. Now, if words aren't enough to just describe the idea of determination, you all know who, again, have heard me speak often. I love to use images because sometimes words aren't enough to describe what we're talking about. So I love this image of this flower that's growing up through this crack in the sidewalk. Determination. All right, where you would say, there's no way a flower can grow in this spot. You've ever seen flowers, typically weeds. Weeds are a little more resilient for whatever reason than flowers, but you'll see weeds growing through cracks all the time. But to see a flower blooming through the crack in pavement or a sidewalk, determination. I don't know how, I don't know when, but I'm not giving up. I'm going to stick to this. I'm going to take the next step. I'm going to get out of bed the next day. Or maybe I stay in bed today and tomorrow I'll get out of bed or the next day. But I'm determined to keep going, to keep moving in this moment, whatever that might look like um, for me. So if you're wondering about this determination, or you say, I don't know if I can be determined, I want you just to, what is your image of determination? This is it for me. This flower growing through a crack. Maybe you have another image that for you is the image you hold on to when you think about determination. Or maybe you have other things that you have found personal agency in, even in the circumstances which you can't control. Viktor Frankl found it in creativity, experiencing something or someone, relationships, and control of our attitude. What is it for you? What is your determination? Right. Two more things. The third component that I wanted to put out there, and again, remember, these aren't the only components, they're just four components. A third component is alignment. This idea of grief feels like this on that side of the slide where all of these things intersecting. How do they align? What does that look like, right? How do I find alignment in my life? And really, when alignment, what I'm really referring to is alignment of values and virtues. Really deciding what you value, what's important. And I understand grief and loss can reconfigure our values, our priorities, what's important to us, what we really have energy for. I've again sat with so many people and I've experienced in my own life this sense of those things pale in comparison. Those those things really don't matter. I think about the book Don't Sweat the Small Stuff. The idea of that grief brings this perspective to us that certain things we used to worry about just aren't as important anymore. And so there are these shifts in what we value, our core beliefs, how they've changed. How have you been impacted by your loss? What does that look like? Um, and then If you can, because if you can identify what it is that you value, what it is that's still important to you, okay? And maybe you say, I don't know what's still important to me. Beginning to take time to ask that question, does it still matter how people treat you? Does it still matter how you treat other people? It could be just very basic values, but what do you value? And then asking yourself, do my behaviors align with what I say I believe? And you might say, well, I don't know that they do fully. All of us have times in our lives when our behaviors and our values don't align. And by the way, behaviors are virtues. And I just want to say that virtues, we've been told since childhood that virtues are gifts that we're given. I don't know about you, but I found I had to work really hard to develop certain virtues in my life. And some of it was trial and error and all sorts of things in life. You've heard the phrase patience is a virtue. And you hear people who say, patience is a virtue and that's a gift I haven't been given. Well, patience is something we develop and we practice. You practice it because we practice behaviors. And so part of it is looking at what do we value and are our behaviors aligned? Or we might say, I would like to value this or this or this more. I would like to have more place more value on patience. And so if you want to place more value on that, we go back to what Mihai learned in his research from flow. And you say, well, then I'm going to choose certain behaviors that align with that value. And in time, that's sort of what we become. We become that kind of person because we've chosen that behavior. So we're living virtues. Behaviors are what we believe. And as we live those virtues, we strengthen our belief that those virtues matter, that those behaviors are important, and those behaviors do mean something in time. They might not in the short term, but in the long run, they really mean something to me. And then the last one that I wanted to talk about, we have about 8 minutes or so left, is the idea of transcendence, to transcend, to rise above or go beyond the limits of. It's the way Webster Dictionary describes this. And then when I think about this idea of to rise above or go beyond the limits of, well, limits of what? So then I thought about this word. How do we combine transcendence with our circumstances? So this concept of circumstantial transcendence, to rise above, adapt to, or find meaning no matter our circumstances. Now that certainly harkens back to Viktor Frankl and what we just talked about, the idea that he decided, I'm going to transcend this experience by being determined to make some of my own choices and be in control of my inputs in this moment because I can't control all of the outputs and I certainly cannot control the circumstances at the moment. But I can rise above, I could adapt to, I can find meaning in the midst of no matter what those circumstances are. Viktor Frankl put it this way, when we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves, implying that there's a choice of who we choose to be in those moments and what that looks like for us. So, just kind of wrapping up things up a little bit, this idea of intentional living, if we kind of take all of those components and put them together and look at them together, we could see intentional living as giving my grief a language rather than running from it or ignoring it or just letting it happen. I'm gonna name it as well. I'm gonna say what it is. It's so hard sometimes to describe what grief is really like, particularly to someone who's not experienced it. But I'm going to lean in there and I'm going to give my grief a language. I'm going to put some words down. I'm going to get to know the new me. I don't know that sometimes we think about it that way, but grief changes us. It's life altering. And so who am I now? What does that look like? Do I have a choice in it? Are there parts of me that are a result of my loss? And I need to better understand that part of me. What does that look like? How have I changed? Intentional living can be embracing our daily decisions rather than just giving up those choices. Grief will have its portion. Grief is going to happen. Whether we're making our choices or not making our choices, grief will happen. Embracing our daily decisions, being intentional about that is important. And it may not feel important at first, but the more we lean into that, the more we see how that becomes a part of where we land. Grief is a transformational experience. It's not about going backwards to the way things were. It's about how our life has been transformed and where we will land. And we can embrace those daily decisions, be intentional about that. We can be a part of that transformation as opposed to just letting the transformation happen without us having any sort of input into it. So focusing on our inputs, not just the outputs. We can pay attention more to the moments, whatever they might be. Slow down and watch the sun go down. Even if you don't feel an emotional connection to it, your brain will be impacted by you sitting and watching that sunset. Recognize your limitations. Intentional living is knowing what my limitations are. I've found the older I get, physically, there are just some limitations. It's just the reality. I exercise, I do all those things to try to keep that going. But the reality is that there are some limitations, and I just recognize them. I don't let them run my life, but I notice them and I'm aware of them. I'm very intentional about that. Also, defining your personal values, being intentional about deciding what I'm going to start valuing, what I'm going to give priority to. Being intentional about living out my values, that once I decide this is important to me, I'm going to be aligned in my behaviors. My beliefs and my behaviors will have alignment. I'm going to practice healthy boundaries, say no more often, or maybe expand some boundaries and say yes more often. I'm going to dip my toe in to the cold part of the pool and let myself adjust a little bit, adapt. Practicing healthy boundaries, focusing on my input, said that, and then just leave us with this thought: intentional living, respond, not react. What are the ways that I can respond to my circumstances, to the things that I'm confronted with on a daily basis, to all the things that continue to happen in life? Even though my loss has happened, this is happening, and I carry it everywhere I go. I have all of these other things happening as well. Intentional living is choosing to respond rather than just react. Take that space. Just take a breath, take another breath, take another breath. Sleep on it. Give yourself a moment rather than just reacting to what's happening in front of you. We are out of time for today, and I just want to thank you all for coming on and spending some time together. Remember, be good to yourself, be kind to yourself, be gracious to yourself. Grief is hard. Grief is hard work. Don't judge yourself too harshly. Consider ideas and thoughts that you might apply to your life. And visit us at compassionatefriends.org. There's many resources you can connect up with. And if you want to connect with me, I will send these slides out to all of you who were here today. I have your emails. If you're listening to this on recording, please feel free to email me, Andy at compassionatefriends.org, and I'd be glad to share these slides with you. Thank you, and I bid you all a peaceful rest of your day.